Today we will be reviewing the history of the Lemania 2310 chronograph. The obscure name helps obfuscate the fact that this movement has been used on everything from the actual Omega moon watch all the way to modern Patek Philippe's. Let's start at the beginning. In the early 30s, the Swiss watch industry was suffering quite badly from the effects of the Great Depression. In an effort to become more stable, Omega, Tissot, and Lemania joined forces as the SSIH. With more financial resources available as a consequence, a Lemania engineer by the name of Albert Piguet was tasked with designing a new chronograph by Omega in the early 40s. It had to be very thin and yet have a high power reserve. The design project was called the 27 CHRO C12. The 27 referred to 27 millimeters diameter, CHRO meant chronograph, and C12 meant 12-hour counter. This came to be known as the Lemania 2310. Omega ended up using a revised version of this, calling it the caliber 321, in the very first Speedmaster they released in 1957. Thanks in part to the sturdy movement, this watch would develop quite the reputation for reliability. This was demonstrated quite well when it was certified for spaceflight and exploration by NASA in 1965. A few years later, a few of the Speedmasters even made it to the moon. Now, despite the success, the 321 was redesigned as the caliber 861 in 1968, in turn losing its column wheel and gaining a higher beat rate, among other changes. That, of course, meant that all of the subsequent quote-unquote first watch worn on the moon engraved Speedmasters were in fact somewhat different movement-wise. As is typical in the watch world, a few decades changed things around quite a bit. Lemania was sold in 1981. A decade later, it became part of Breguet, which in turn was swallowed up by the Swatch Group in 1999, just in time for the mechanical watch renaissance. Since the 90s, the Lemania 2310 has been used as a base for many high-end manufacturers. First up, we have Patek Philippe's 5070 chronograph, which uses a modified and better finished movement, which they call the caliber 2872. Despite all of the modifications, the similarities are quite clear in the photo. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that Patek replaced it with a fully in-house made movement in the late 2000s, the Lemania-based ones still command incredibly high prices. Next up is Vacheron Constantin, who used the swan neck regulator version of the 2310, the 2320, as a base for their caliber 1141. Again, while nicely finished and obviously modified, it still shares the same lineage as the original Speedmaster released in 1957. And my last example is Breguet, who did the same, not surprisingly, since Lemania got absorbed into them. Their version was the caliber 533.2, based on the swan neck regulator version of the 2310. I particularly enjoyed researching the history of this movement. It was amazing to discover that the 2310 had been involved in so many historically significant events and watches, and on top of it all, Albert Piguet ended up living long enough to see almost all of them. Well, that's about it, and as usual, thanks for watching.